Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us here at the Rubin, and welcome to everybody on Facebook, watching us on Facebook Live, streaming to the world from the foothills of Chelsea, where we try and translate some of the high principles of wisdom drawn from Himalayan Asia and deliver it to you in the 21st century here in New York City. My name is Tim McHenry, and I'm Director of Programs and Engagement, along with a fabulous team of collaborators who present this series and many others. This one is called Brainwave, where we choose to interact with mind scientists and other folks of life to figure out how our brain works. And one of the central tenets of much of the art that we display upstairs in our galleries, which happens to be Buddhist, a central Buddhist tenet is everything is subject to change. And how fitting then that Dr. Leonard Mlodinow has just brought out a book called Elastic, Flexible Thinking in a Time of Change. Because times, they are a-changin', folks, and we need to adapt to them. And fortunately, we have the ability and the tools and the plasticity with which to do so. And Dr. Mlodinow, as he does with every book of his, is so able to translate complex ideas into words and language that we all can readily embrace and understand. And he is a great sort of really translator of high principles into stuff that we can get and grasp onto. I mean, he wrote for MacGyver and Star Trek, so he's able to do that sort of stuff. And he has a degree in theoretical physics. So the combination is really quite explosive, as you will find tonight. And Leonard, thank you so much for making your debut here and celebrating your book with us. He is joined by his sometime buddy, sometime rival in ideas, Dr. Deepak Chopra, who himself is no slouch in translating complex ideas of consciousness and well-being into how we can actually activate our understandings of existence. And you know, I think he's done more than anyone in our hemisphere to really help us understand these complex ideas that are actually deafeningly simple. Yet we don't tend to understand until we can experience them. And so with the Chopra Foundation Center, he's managed to create a space in which we can embrace them, live them, and engage with them so that we not only intellectually get it, but viscerally understand. And so he's translated the Buddha's precepts that he reached when he was under the Bodhi tree, which defy language, into a contemporary understanding that we are slowly starting to embrace. So Dr. Chopra, thank you so much for your meaningful contribution and necessary and urgent contribution to understanding these important principles of adaptation, change, and engagement, understanding of community. So this whole year at the Rubin, we're embracing this idea that the future is fluid. That's also change. And so how the intersection of social engagement, time, adaptation meet, well, you're going to find that out tonight with the help of Dr. Mlodinow and Dr. Chopra. Please welcome them to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you. Thanks for being here. What wasn't mentioned also is Leonard is co-author with Stephen Hawking on many books, including Grand Design, A Briefer History of Time, and of course his very well-known books on how randomness rules our lives, Subliminal, The Upright Thinkers, on and on. But today we are going to talk about elastic thinking, and then a little bit later we're going to talk about the healing self. So Leonard, I've really enjoyed reading your book, and I'm still not done. But
you read far enough to have questions for me.
yeah, we have some questions. Let's get right to the questions right away, because even though time doesn't exist, we have a perception of it anyway, or an experience of it. Let's start with the questions, and then we can go back and forth a little bit. But would you tell us what you mean by elastic thinking?
Well, I talk about 3 ways that biological systems process information. The simplest, most primitive way is scripted thinking, or sometimes psychologists call them fixed action patterns, but it's not just humans that do it. All animals do it, even in a sense bacteria do it. And those are very reflexive ways of processing information. The data comes in, whether it's a bacteria sensing chemicals or an insect sensing chemicals or light, and it gets processed in an automatic way, the same way every time, and an answer comes out. One example of it, for instance, is a mother goose sitting on the nest. If one of her eggs falls out, she'll reach her neck over and she'll bring it back in. This looks as if it's the loving action of a loving mother, but scientists have noticed that if they put a crumpled beer can next to the nest, she'll do the same thing, or even a volleyball, or she'll try to do it. So it really isn't any kind of thinking at all. It's a reflexive action, and especially primitive animals live that way most of their lives. Evolution has provided that because they live in a non-changing routine environment. The mother goose doesn't often have a beer can next to her nest or a volleyball, so the fact that she does this unthinkingly doesn't hurt the species. They survive just fine. But for situations where there's change in the environment, other kinds of thinking are needed. And human beings have a more sophisticated kind of thinking, which is still not tailored toward change, but is better than those fixed action patterns. And that's logical or rational thought, analytical thinking, where you have the rules of logic to get from A to B to C and so on. And that's gotten us far. So far that, the society values it very much. We test it on the SATs, schools ask for it, employers try to find it in people. And it's a very powerful way of thinking.
Is that a result of education?
Well, it's built into our brain. The ability is built into our brain, but we get practice with it, and we become better through education. We also become worse at it in ways through education. Yes. That's a whole other discussion, Deepak.
Yes.
But it's another standard way that we think, but it's also best applied to situations where the methodologies are set, where the framework of our thinking, the questions that we're asking are fixed, the framework is fixed, and then we apply that to get from that framework and those propositions from A to B. But when things change, when we have new challenges we haven't seen before, or the situations come up that are similar to the way we've seen, but they have a twist on them, those kinds of thinking tend to fail, just like the mother goose with the beer can. And for that, we humans especially, much more than any other animal, have this elastic thinking, which is it's a thinking where you're not following the rules, you're making up the rules, or you're breaking the rules, or even the act of deciding that the rules need to be broken or that the old rules don't apply anymore. It's how we adapt to change and how we get new ideas and come up with innovations. And that's why I wrote the book, because society today is changing faster than ever before. The change in society tends to be exponential, but an exponential change doesn't change quickly at the beginning. It just means that things double at a fixed time. So if you have 1 cent and it might double every year, that's an exponential rise, but you're only gaining 1 cent the first year and you're getting 2 cents the next year. Once you get to another part of the curve where you have $1 million, then now you're getting somewhere when it doubles in a year. And that's what's happened to society today. The change has gotten to the point where, as it continues to double at a fixed interval, we're having trouble coping with it, and elastic thinking is the remedy.
Okay, that's great, and I want to go through all the questions I had, but based on what you said right now, what does elastic thinking have to do with creativity, if anything?
Well, elastic thinking is in some ways a larger realm than creativity. There are certain realms, aspects of elastic thinking that are important in creativity, such as imagination, idea generation, the generation of ideas. And then there are certain aspects of of elastic thinking that are important in problem solving, but not strictly speaking creativity. For instance, being mindful of how you're thinking and figuring out how to identify the assumptions, the hidden assumptions that you're making, and how to determine whether they're the proper assumptions or not.
But you do need elastic thinking for creativity?
Yes, and also, but I have to say that, make it very clear that creativity needs some aspects of elastic thinking, but creativity also needs this logical, analytical thinking. Because ideas without guidance are just like babbling. And in order to create something that's useful and to have a creative product, you need to have the logical, analytical part of your brain guide the elastic part of your brain together to form something creative.
Okay. I might want to come back to that afterwards, but
since you're in charge, that'll be easy.
Yeah. Okay. So what you talk a lot about in this book about bottoms up thinking and top down thinking. I don't think anybody in the audience know the difference. Well,
so top down thinking is the kind of thinking where you have the thinking is guided by a CEO, or they call it in your brain an executive function, or a designer, someone figuring out what to do, or a programmer, and having that plan executed. It's the way that computers used to operate. Well, most computers still operate. It's the traditional way computers operate, where a programmer forms an algorithm that the computer is going to execute to get the answer. Bottom-up thinking is completely different. Bottom-up thinking is what, for instance, ants do, ant colonies. Scientists who study ants tend to consider the colony as more of an organism than the individual ant. The ants themselves have very simple rules that they go by, which determine what they do, where they go forward, backward, turn left, turn right. If they encounter this chemical, they do this, and etc. There are those fixed action patterns, scripted things, and they're very simple scripts that they follow. And yet, when you have a colony of thousands and thousands of ants, that colony can create a sum of those parts that's much greater than the parts themselves, a whole that's greater than the sum. In mathematics, we call it an emergent property. For instance, when an ant colony comes to a gap that they have to cross as they're marching somewhere, they might get together and form a chain and make a bridge over that gap, and the other ants will climb over them, over the bridge. There's no designer, there's no architect, there's no CEO, there's no boss. Somehow they just do it. And they've developed that method through millions of years of evolution, which has adjusted the rules in a way that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. But our brains work in exactly the same way. Our neurons are like the ants. Our neurons follow very simple rules, and they're connected to each other, much more connected than the ants. Each neuron is connected to about 1 to 10,000 other neurons. And somehow, through the very simple rules that they follow, by getting signals from other neurons and giving off signals, the sum, or the whole, which is our thinking, is much greater than the sum of the parts of the neurons. So the human brain is capable of this amazing bottom-up thinking, like ants on steroids, right? But the brain is also hierarchical. So the brain doesn't just have all these neurons working. It has organizational structure, where the neurons are formed into structures, and those structures are united into bigger structures, and they're united into bigger structures on many multiple levels. And when you get to the high levels, those higher level structures, they do the executive function. So our brains can work both ways. We have high level structures that act as an executive, that tell our minds what to do, what to focus on, what to pay attention to, how to think, competing with, at the same time, the bubbling cauldron of our little neurons trying to give us random ideas that they're coming up with, like the ants. And so as these two interact with each other, we have different kinds of thinking. And what's important in maximizing your elastic thinking is learning how to take control of that.
Give me an example of bottoms-up thinking in a human being.
Well, if you have a problem or an issue in life, and you sit down and think very hard about it, and you want to solve that problem, overcome the issue or the challenge, you most likely start with logical, analytical thinking. You try to reason it out, okay? And quite often you'll come into a barrier, and you'll get nowhere. You don't know the answer to the problem. Or if you're in a creative field, for instance, when I'm writing the book, I don't know how to write that chapter. Or when I wrote that The Remembrance of Stephen Hawking. I had no idea what I wanted to write. And the logical, analytical side of me wasn't going to really give me the answer. But after you set up the problem in your head, then you learn to relax, to defocus your brain, to let that cauldron of ideas bubble up from your unconscious mind where it starts up to your conscious mind, and ideas suddenly come to you. I'm sure all of you have had that, where you have a problem and you think about it and suddenly the answer comes to you. Or you told me yourself, Deepak, that when you write the books, you think about it, go to bed, in the morning the chapter's written, right? Well, so that's what's happening.
Yeah. Early in my career, I was very close to Candace Pert, who actually gave the phrase molecules of emotion. And I know we're going a little bit off the script here that I had planned, but she once said to me, our body is our subconscious mind. And at that time, we were still looking at things like serotonin and oxytocin, dopamine, opiates, etc. But now that we know that our microbiome is 99% of the genetic information in our body is in the microbiome, but even more important, the microbiome genes are responsible for more than 90% of the serotonin that's produced in our body, not the brain. And the gut is in fact a nervous system, not only because of the microbiome, but also the neural networks there, and there are now neural networks that we're looking at the heart. So people say, I have a gut feeling about such and such, or the heart has reasons that reason doesn't know. I was thinking that bottoms-up thinking could include this whole gestalt of whole body thinking in a way.
It definitely does. And the bottom-up, the elastic thinking also takes a lot of input from your emotions, which are thought to be detrimental to your logical, rational thinking, and certainly there's no room in the rules of logic for emotion, but there is in elastic thinking, in your bottom-up thinking. It's your emotions are extremely closely tied to the state of your body.
Mm-hmm. So everyone's heard this phrase, we use only 10% of our brain. Now, I've been working with Rudy, and that seems a myth. We use 100% of our brain, but you have a good take on this, that we use 100% of our brain, but probably a very little of the potential that's there, inherent in our thinking, right?
True. So it's definitely a myth that there are parts of our brain that are unused. It's all being used, but it may not all being used to our optimal use. And what's happens in your brain is that our brains are really idea machines. They're constantly given any topic, any challenge, any problem in your life. Your brain is generating tons of ideas. And these are coming on the unconscious level. If they all surfaced into your consciousness, you'd be non-functional because you drown in all these ideas that are coming. Some of the ideas are pretty good, some of them are pretty silly, weird, and your brain tries to filter out those. It has these, what the psychologists call cognitive filters, which kill the ideas that don't seem very promising. But that's a good thing, though. That's why if you think about going to Europe, you don't consider swimming there or jumping there. You know that you take a plane, you're not going to drive there, but your mind is generating ideas like that. Or your behavior also depends on that. You get ideas, or you get impulses for behavior that get censored at an unconscious level by these filters. So that's good because it keeps inappropriate ideas and behavior away, and it suppresses silly or useless ideas. But it can also suppress ideas that may at first seem silly or useless, but are really good. They're original, they're new, they're different. They're things that people don't normally think of because these filters are working. And so that's what I mean when I say you're not really using all of your brain unless you learn to relax those filters and harvest all those great ideas that, from that sea of questionable ideas, and find the gems there, mine them, and bring them into your consciousness.
Would you say filters are the same thing as editing mechanisms?
Well, you could look at it that way. What you have are a large number of ideas. If they were all written in a book, the filter would be the editor who comes and takes out the dumb ones, right? Mm-hmm. And or you could look at it as a sieve that keeps back certain ideas.
See, since Buddhism was brought up here, and we're in a place which champions Eastern thought, most of our filters, according to the traditions of the East, are a result of the conditioned mind, which starts getting conditioned very early in childhood, whether it's through education or religion or economics or just culture. So most of the ideas that we have, I think, all our thoughts are actually not original at all. They're recycled, collective, conditioned mind, based on these days especially what's happening in the media. You read in the news, now everybody's talking this is fake news, this is real news. It doesn't matter. But do we really, 99% of humanity, have any elastic thinking at all? Or are we just kind of becoming bundles of conditioned reflexes and nerves that are constantly being triggered by people and circumstance into very predictable outcomes based on, the rigidity of collective thinking?
I don't believe that is the sole manner in which humans operate, and that they can certainly rise above that and do every day in your own life. But that is also a way that people act much more often than they realize. Just like with the mother goose, there have been experiments on humans that show in complex social interactions we can follow these mindless reactive scripts. There's Ellen Langer, who I know you like, as a psychologist, was at Yale and Harvard, did an experiment a while back where she stationed a graduate student near a copying machine. And when people came up to the copying machine, the graduate student would try and get his stuff in before they did. And they had 3 different questions they would ask, and she measured the success rate of each way of asking. One was, I have 5 copies to make. Can I get in front of you, please? That was successful about 50% of the time, which surprised me. But maybe they were more kinder times. The second way was, I have 5 copies to make. Can I get in front of you, please? Because I'm in a hurry. That was successful 94% of the time. That's a good bump, okay? Now, sounds like these people are standing there at the copying machine. They listening to this person ask the information, give them information. They're making a decision, deciding, well, they're in a hurry, I'm not. Go ahead and get in front of me. But she was wondering, maybe that's not true. Maybe they're like the mother goose, and they're just conditioned to, they may automatically say no, or half the time they'll say no when there's no reason given. But if there's a reason given, they will let the person in. It doesn't matter what the reason is. Maybe they're not even listening, just like the mother goose isn't really scrutinizing whether this is an egg. So the third way the graduate student would try to get in was to say, again, it started off the same way. I have 5 pages to make. Can I get in front of you, please? And then he would say, because I have pages to copy. Doesn't add much, right? It's kind of a joke, but 93% success rate with that. So if you want to convince somebody of something, just give a reason. Even if you don't have a good reason, just give a reason. But this is obviously a scripted thinking that you're talking about, but we can rise above that. I don't think when Einstein invented general relativity that he was reacting to this morass of ordinary conventional...
Yeah, well, Einstein and people like him, or artists, frequently break the rule, right? They're disruptive.
But we all do in our lives. If you're thinking of making a vacation, going on vacation, and you're thinking of going to some new different place or getting there in a different way or trying a new website, that's all elastic thinking, because you're not just following your old ways. You're not just using reasoning. You're saying, do I really want to go there? Why am I going to Hawaii? Is it out of habit? What am I really after on this vacation? Or whatever you're asking, can benefit from it. Even in your larger life. A lot of people go through life being somewhat satisfied with their lives, let's say, or dissatisfied, somewhat satisfied, not totally satisfied, right? But they don't question why they're doing what they do or what the alternatives are, and they just keep going in their life that way. And I'm someone who can speak to that because I've had so many different careers of, physicist and writing for TV, computer games, writing books. Worked as an executive for a few years.
Star Trek.
Yeah, so I'm always going. I'm the opposite, which maybe I have too much of that, where I'm always going, are you sure? Don't you want to try something new? But those are ways that elastic thinking enters into everyone's lives.
The example that you just heard from Ellen Langer is in the book, and it turns out that as I was writing my book, I was also quoting.
You have a great. You should just you should tell the credit card story.
No, even more interesting than the credit card story is that.
Wait a minute. Okay, if he says this, let me tell you the credit card story. Okay. She goes to pay with her credit card. The clerk says that you didn't sign it. She signs it, okay? Then the clerk gives her the bill. She signs the bill. Then the clerk takes the credit card and the bill and compares it to make sure it's the same person signed them. So this is a script that she normally does for all bills and credit cards, but when you actually see the person sign, you don't have to do that, right?
Yes.
Okay, let's see how your story goes.
No, my story, because I'm interested in the biology of aging, she did an experiment in the 80s where she had older people in their 80s go to a nursing home or a resort, actually, but and then she had to control group somewhere else. But these people were instructed to pretend that they were in their 50s. So they wore the same fashions, clothing, they watched movies like Anatomy of a Murder, Alfred Hitchcock, heard music from that era, Elvis Presley, etc. And then she looked at the biological markers of aging, at that time not so sophisticated, but still things like flexibility, skin thickness, and blood pressure, and many other things. And in 1 week, the biological markers of aging had significantly changed, just because they were in the mood psychologically, emotionally, and actually behaving in a different era. The biology shifted.
And it's a very important point. Your mindset is extremely important. It's amazing how influential your mindset is, and that's one of the points of the book, is that you can work to change your mindset to think in different ways. But one of the experiments that I really like on that, they gave people these problems, the word problems, where they give you 3 words, like crab, pine, and sauce. I got to make sure to say those 3 words and not the 4th word, which is the solution. Crab, pine, and sauce. And they say find another word that goes with each of them. For instance, crab, pine, and sauce. You could say cone, pine cone, but there's no cone sauce or sauce cone, so that doesn't work. But you want to find a word that works with all 3 of them. And there's 2 approaches. One is to use your rational thought to just start finding words that go with one of them and then checking whether they go with the second one, with the third one, and if not, throw it out, keep going. That's how a traditional computer would do it. That was a computer that was programmed in the traditional way. The other way is to do what we talked about earlier, where you think about the problem and then you let it percolate, and you do something else, and you rest, and then suddenly, bam, it comes to you as a sudden insight. So I don't know how many of you got this problem. This problem, I forget the statistics, I think half or a third of the people get it within a minute or 2 or something like that. The answer in this case is apple, applesauce, pineapple, and what did I say? Crab apple, applesauce. So, but this is the interesting thing about this experiment was people solve it in an fMRI where the brains are being imaged, and they can the scientists can watch what parts of the brain are working, and they can watch how the different parts of the brain are either executing logical thinking or this elastic thinking that leads to the sudden insight. And after the people answered the question, they asked them, which way did you solve it? And people would say, I reasoned it out, or it just suddenly came to me. But the scientists actually could predict from the fMRI machine before the person even knew how they solved it, how they were going to solve it. And they know this because they could tell before they even gave them the question how they were going to solve it. They could tell, are they going to use insight or are they going to use elastic thinking, or are they going to use logic to solve this problem? By looking at the fMRI, they could see what parts of the brain were working. It was their mindset. They would go into it with a mindset of one way or the other. So it was fascinating. Your mindset determines how you approach a problem.
So how many people here have heard of cognitive behavioral therapy? You have, huh? How many people are familiar with the work of Byron Katie or Katie Byron? A few. So, I'm thinking that elastic thinking has a lot to do with breaking rigid patterns too of thinking and also belief systems, because people have a lot of limiting beliefs. I never can lose weight, I'll never be successful, I'm not good enough, etc. And the principles of cognitive therapy say you question those. So whatever the belief is that's holding you back, I can't lose weight, or my husband doesn't like me, or I'll never be president of whatever, you actually write down that thought and then you ask yourself if it's true, and you have a yes or no response to it. Then you ask yourself again, am I 100% sure if that's true or not? And now again, yes or no. By now, you're not so sure, and you've held on to this rigid pattern of thinking all these years, and now you're questioning it. And then you ask yourself, what does holding on to this thought do to me? And then you write the answer. And then who would I be without this thought? And then you write the opposite of that. And the more you reflect on your rigid patterns of thinking, they start to kind of loosen their hold on you.
Right, and that's one important aspect of elastic thinking, is to learn how to do that, not just in your own personal life, but in any issue or challenge that you face. It's often you don't even realize that there are assumptions there. That's what's so hard about it. You might not know that you're making those assumptions.
And some of these assumptions go back maybe to things you heard in your childhood, right?
Right, that you heard, that your family has told you or implied, or their social. Actually, one good example of a hidden assumptions are riddles. Usually riddles are difficult because you're making a hidden assumption that you're not aware of. To solve a riddle, once you get the assumption right, you realize you're making an assumption, the riddle is not rocket science, it's very simple. Like here's one that I have in the book. Marge and Mary had the same mother and father and were born at the same time, yet they are not twins. How is that possible? So don't say anything, but think about it for just a second. So they had the same parents, born at the same time, but they're not twins. Okay? Like most riddles, people find that hard to understand and hard to solve, and you can't solve it using analytical reasoning. You have to solve it by changing the way you're picturing the situation. So anyone can blurt out the answer. They're triplets or quadruplets. So when you hear Marjorie and Mary are siblings that had the same blah, 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 you picture Marjorie and Mary. You picture a pair. Picturing a pair is detrimental to envisioning a trio, right? So once you realize that you made that assumption, the answer is not hard because it's just pretty trivial. And that happens in all aspects of life.
Very interesting. What is neophilia?
So neophilia means the love of the new.
What does it have to do with it?
That wasn't the end. I was just pausing for dramatic effect, but but it's always good to pause and get a laugh too. So when I first started running Elastic, I was reading some of these business journals, and they kept talking about how people resist change. Okay, how do we get over the natural resistance of change, the people's natural human aversion to change, etc., etc. Meanwhile, I know in the psychology literature we have this neophilia, that people like new stuff and they get bored if it doesn't change, and no one wants a very routine job where you're doing the same thing all the time. So how do you reconcile these two? And as I read further, I found that, okay, let's look at the business articles. What change are they talking about? They're talking about the change, we're having a reorganization. You have to learn to do 25% more work for the same money. Or we're going to reorganize and cut 10%. It might be you, I don't know. Those are the kinds of change that people resist, okay? But if someone called you, if your boss called you in the office and said, hey, we had a reorganization. The company is too efficient. We're trying to get less efficient. So you need to do 25% less work for the same money. You'd love that change, right? So it's the same change that you're resisting when it's the other way. So what people don't like are negative consequences, risk, insecurity, but they don't resist change. And as it turns out, we even have a gene that's related to our exploratory impulse and our neophilia. It's called DRD4. It has to do with dopamine in the reward centers of your brain. And scientists have found that about 100,000 years ago, there was a kind of a catastrophic climate change. Sounds familiar. In Africa, when modern humans were living in Africa, and we dwindled down to maybe thousands, hundreds, some people say dozens of individuals. And the groups that survived had this gene, seemed to have had this extra gene, or not this extra gene, but a form of this gene that made them more neophilic, and more exploratory. And they were able to wander further to find more resources in order to survive. And while the other humans died out, this was like a bottleneck that changed the way people think. And after that, people started spreading more and more around the world. And so it's all within us, even though there are individual differences in humans. Some people, I'll go to a restaurant and there'll be a dish there that I love, that I really am dying to have. And though the other dishes will look pretty crummy, I don't want to eat them. And I'm going to order one of them anyway, because I can't stand ordering the same thing. I got to try something new, even if I know it's going to be probably lousy. I'm not saying it's always a good thing, the neophilia. It's not. I talk about a guy in there who had such neophilia that he went to live with grizzly bears and ended up getting eaten. So for individuals, it's not good, but it's great for society to have this whole spectrum of people, because the people who are exploring are discovering things that everybody could find useful. So, and I have a test in the book, what we call an inventory in psychology in the book, where you can assess your own neophilia, but you can also work, if you want to increase it or decrease it and take control.
So, in contrast to elastic thinking is frozen thinking.
Frozen, and that's a term that was coined by Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher, and she was writing about the Nazi period and how people sometimes have beliefs, again, as we've been talking about, that are so much a part of them that they don't even question where they come from. And they can't see any other way of thinking. And I think the parallels to what's going on in politics and society today are obvious. So people who believe one side or the other can't help but thinking the other side is fill in the blank. It's not a good blank. So that happens not just in politics, but it happens in science, it happens in art, it happens in a lot of different fields. But it's, again, something that you have to fight. And I talk in the book about the value of diversity and the value of conflict, the value of talking to people who think differently or the opposite of you. You may not find it pleasant to talk to people who completely disagree with you, but it's good for you. So you should do it, and you should do it sincerely and try to understand where they're coming from. Try to understand why someone that you might respect or love could feel something diametrically opposed to what you're thinking, and try and open your mind to that. It's also good to focus on times where you were just wrong, where you were proven wrong. We try to forget the times we were wrong, but it's better to think about the times you're wrong, because it broadens your thinking and makes you realize that what you're thinking might not be the truth, and you should consider other points of view and other ideas.
Coming back to a Buddhist principle, one of the 8 noble paths to enlightenment is correct perspective. And Buddha says correct perspective is either no perspective or all perspectives. So, you talked about emergence a little while ago, and a lot is being said about emergence, especially in creative problem solving. And Dan Siegel, who's you've met, neuropsychiatrist from UCLA, he says if you take any problem and you get a lot of people together to look at that problem, but they're from disparate disciplines, so it doesn't matter what the problem is. I could be trying to treat a patient with an intractable disease, and one of the problems is that if you have a specialist for that particular disease, the specialist will have very little elastic thinking because he knows a lot about that disease, and he can't or she can't get out of the pigeonhole of looking at the disease any other way. But if you get people who are generalists along with the specialists, but then you get people from other disciplines, the humanities, from music, from art, from architecture, from mathematics, you put maximum diversity of disparate disciplines, you have them look at the problem, you have them give whatever opinion you have, you keep the whole process transparent without criticism, and you have an open system, and then you incubate. For us, the incubation is usually meditation, but you could go walk in the park, or you could, hike in the mountains, or you could listen to music, and you just let it stay there in that collective incubation, and then somehow emergence happens. Some ideas trickle through that nobody had thought of before, and then they start saying, that's this. So I think we're also moving in an era where people, especially doing research, for example, like now we're doing a lot of research on mindfulness and mindful awareness and how that affects gene expression or telomerase or gut microbiome, etc. It's so complex that unless you get a lot of people from different disciplines to look at that whole thing, it's very easy to get caught up in rigid patterns of thinking. But collective emergence is something we should be looking at now, even for elastic thinking.
Yeah, I mean, as a theoretical physicist, I know that I work much better with other people. And most papers that you see in theoretical physics are done by groups of people, 2, 3, 4 people, because everybody brings a different point of view, and all the points of view have to mix to give you an answer that is greater than the sum, more than each individual could come up with working on their own. And, excuse me, in the book, I thought it was vodka. In the book,
I'm making my own cognac right now.
Okay. Give me some. I talk about a firm called Intellectual Ventures, where their principle is to work in a bottom-up fashion. They have all these different people from different specialties mingling with each other, and they come up with really inventive things, one of which is, I want to mention, it's a kind of a Star Wars system to shoot mosquitoes out of the air. And it sounds like using a hammer to kill a bug, or using a bazooka, but it's actually extremely important invention because it's for use in Africa where malaria is a big problem. And they've invented a system that uses approximately the energy of a light bulb and can detect at a distance and shoot down about 30 mosquitoes a second. And it's just, I won't go into all the ideas behind it, but it had to do with people from laser physics, from computers, insect specialists, a whole group of people that came up with this like crazy idea, and they're preparing to market it right now. So if they hadn't brought those people together. We would just get cans of Raid, I guess,
So I had a lot of questions here, but we're not going to have time to look at all these questions, but they are from the book, and I'd encourage you to look at the book. But there's one question that I do want to ask you about, because I'd never heard of this term before, and then perhaps we can move on to some of the ideas in my book that may or may not,
first, will you pass the cognac?
may or may not agree with what you've said. We've been rivals in the past in many issues, we still are, but we're great friends and we've had a great time and learned a lot from each other. In fact, I taught Leonard how to meditate, and the question is schizotypy. What the heck is schizotypy?
So, some years ago, scientists noticed that the children of people with schizophrenia tended to have more original ideas. And they started studying them behaviorally and genetically, and they found that there is a trait that at one far end leads towards schizophrenia, but can fall short of that. And the trait has to do with the propensity to have different, unusual, strange ideas. And this, of course, is related to those filters in your brain again, to the level at which the filters are set. If they're set too far, you can become detached from reality, and that's not good, usually. Sometimes we do that on purpose, but and if it's set too far on the other side, then everything you think of as conventional, and you never have any new ideas. So I have another inventory there where you can test yourself on that. But really the best example of that is John Nash, who you might know was the subject of the book, The Beautiful Mind, A Beautiful Mind, who was a Nobel Prize-winning mathematician / economist, and he was on the borderline and spent many years in schizophrenia, in a schizophrenic state, and he thought that he was being talked to by aliens, and there were vast conspiracies and all kinds of weird stuff, and yet his ideas that he did when he was not in that state, but when he was on the other side, got him a Nobel Prize. And after he got out of his schizophrenic state, which he was in his later years, he was healthier, a friend of him asked him, how could a person so brilliant as you to have these amazingly original ideas in mathematics also have thought that aliens were talking to you about vast conspiracies? And he said, because those ideas came from the same place in my brain and seemed just as real. So that's schizotypy.
That's fascinating. I've always personally thought I only want to hang out with sages, psychotics, and geniuses. It's the only way to break out of these rigid patterns of thinking. So you'll find a lot of very amazing insights in Leonard's book, and I encourage you to read it. Flexible Thinking at a Time of Change right now. The world is in crisis, right? I think we can't deny that with all that's happening, with rigid thinking, racism, bigotry, hatred, prejudice, extinction of species, climate change, war, terrorism, mechanized death, risking our own extinction. We need elastic thinking. Thank you, Leonard.
Thank you.
You have any questions for me?
I do. You want me to ask? I marked it up. So.
Listen, only 10 minutes because we want to get the audience to ask a few questions.
Okay. Shall I?
If you want.
I would love to. You say the dividing line, I like this, the dividing line between what happens automatically in our minds and what happens voluntarily isn't fixed.
What happens automatically
and what happens voluntarily?
Well, voluntarily requires a moment of pause and choice. I always, in my own thinking, I make choices consciously. So I don't know if you are familiar with this word metacognition, which is not in the book, but metacognition means being aware of any experience as it's happening. So you have a silent witnessing awareness to any experience that is happening, sensory experience, this experience, being aware of it as it's happening, but also being aware of the choices you're making as you're making those choices. That goes beyond ordinary thinking into voluntary thinking, voluntary choices.
I guess I should back up to and say, and ask you the same question that you asked me. What is the healing self?
I think we can actually do that question and then let the audience
Sounds
ask
good. All the rest of my work.
Okay, no, but I think
No,
because the healing self is the title of the book, and you asked the right question. Okay, so the word healing etymologically comes from the same word as whole. Whole, which is also the basis of the word heal. Wholeness, healing, health, and holy. Holy. But when I say holy, we are not talking about self-righteous morality, but that holistic way of thinking. Now, Leonard said the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Here we are in the home of Buddhism and Buddhist art. From the Buddhist perspective, parts are actually patterns of behavior of the whole. In fact, there are no such things as parts, even though it helps us think in terms of parts. I'm talking now about the healing self. So you have a liver, you have a kidney, you have a microbiome, you have the nervous system, you have the endocrine system, you have the immune system, and then you have mind, then you have emotions, then you have personal relationships, social interactions. That's the wholeness of experience. Now, what we do, especially the way we've been trained, reductionism in science, but also in biology, is you look at the parts and you divide the parts into further parts. And so you look at the organs, then the tissues, then you go deeper and deeper till you get to the level of molecular biology, genome, even there, transcriptome, etc. You keep going till you get to the finest level of the part. And it works, mechanistic understanding of that in acute illness works. But in chronic illness, and chronic illness is the majority of illness that we're trying to tackle right now. If you have an acute illness, you have a pneumonia or you've got a crisis in cancer or autoimmune disease, you want to be looking at the part and handling it. But in chronic illness, what we're learning is that in 95% of chronic illness, even the gene mutations that cause chronic disease. So, there are genetic mutations that are linked to disease, but only 5% of disease-related gene mutations are fully penetrant, which means they guarantee the disease. So if somebody has a BRCA gene, for example, for breast cancer, that guarantees the disease. Angelina Jolie is the big example. She had to have a preventive mastectomy because that gene would guarantee that disease. Even for that, by the way, in the next few years, there's hope because of you'll be able to cut and paste a gene editing, CRISPR, you've heard of that. But 95% of disease-related gene mutations that actually cause disease or thought to cause disease, they don't guarantee the disease. So for example, for Alzheimer's, there are 40 genes associated with Alzheimer's, only 3 guarantee the disease. Cancer, there are hundreds, because cancer is not one disease, hundreds of genes associated, mutations. Less than 5% guarantee the disease. This is true of all illness. So what is the healing self what is the self? Self is you who makes choices every day for your well-being. And if you pay attention only to 6 things, good sleep. I remember when I was resident one night, I got up to go to the restroom and I heard my nurse screaming at a patient, "Mr. Smith, will you please wake up? I have to give you your sleeping pill." So I went up to her and I said, "You're waking this poor guy up to give him a sleeping pill." She said, "Yeah, because I know he'll wake up in 15 minutes. Then he'll wake me up, then I'll wake you up." I said, "No, please give him the sleeping pill." And then as I looked into the whole situation, I discovered that 90% of the prescriptions in the hospital were for 5 things: pain, anxiety, nausea, insomnia, and constipation. You want
Big 5, huh? The big 5.
The big 5. And you know what the acronym is? PANIC. PANIC. That's the big 5. So in any case, good sleep, stress management in any form, for us again, mindful awareness, mindfulness, that's the great gift that the Buddha gave to the world. 2,500 years ago, he gave the gift of mindful awareness, which was very complete: awareness of sensory experience, awareness of body, awareness of what's happening inside your body. For those of you who practice yoga, it's called, these days we call it introception, but he called it awareness of pratyahara, which is this yogic term of how you can become aware of what's happening inside your body, including heart rate and peristaltic movements, and even ways to change that. So mindful awareness and meditation, second. Number 3, movement, exercise, but more precisely the mind-body coordination that we associate with yogic practices. And so now we found out that the most important nerve in the body, autonomic nervous system, is something called the vagus nerve. And it's very interesting that the word vagus is connected to the English word vagabond. So the vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve, and it emerges from the midbrain, but it influences everything, the tone of your voice. If you're anxious, your voice will be different than if you're relaxed, happy, friendly. Every mood influences the tone of your voice. The vagus nerve also influences heart rate variability, which is the finest measure of whether you're stressed or not, or whether you're on sympathetic overdrive. So if somebody is even thinking of something that's traumatic, their sympathetic overdrive will override their vagal tone. But the yogasanas that we do in yoga and the breathing techniques we do, they directly stimulate the vagus nerve and influence heart rate variability. The vagus nerve goes through the diaphragm, pierces the diaphragm in the intestine, influences the activity of the microbiome, which is 99% of the genetic information, and there's bidirectional traffic from the gut to the brain. So, the brain and the gut are speaking to each other. In fact, bidirectional traffic now we know from all autonomic nerves back to the brain. So, don't underestimate the power of yogasana. Yogasana, which is normally translated as postures, yogic postures. If you look at the original Sanskrit, they are called seats of awareness. So everything you do, whether it's cat-cow or sun salutation or whatever, it's a seat of awareness that is influencing a particular autonomic nerve. Okay, so movement is third. Emotions. If you are experiencing stress, anger, hostility, guilt, depression, shame, any form of emotion that separates you from the world, so the Buddha had the 4 or 5 what he called divine emotions, which connect you with everyone. Love, compassion, empathy, joy, equanimity. So you can look up the Sanskrit words, or you probably know them, but he said if you cultivate emotions of love, compassion, joy, empathy, and equanimity, you will heal your physical body. Now we're looking at actually what happens. We paid so much attention on stress, but nobody's looked at these emotions.
Positive emotions.
Positive emotions. How do they influence what's happening? So the healing self is basically going back to what we call homeostasis or self-regulation, that happens if you cultivate these simple practices. Emotions. The fourth is nutrition. And, I used to, in my resident days, people used to come to me and say, I changed my diet and my asthma went away. Or I changed my diet and my arthritis went away. It didn't make any sense to me because I had no way to understand that. Now we know that as soon as you put food in your body, the first thing it acts at is your microbiome, which is the genetic information of the bacteria in your gut. And so now there are artificial intelligence techniques that can look at a stool sample and they can tell you exactly which foods are suitable for your microbiome and which foods will cause inflammation in your microbiome. These techniques are already available. So, everybody says, I eat spinach, that's very healthy for me. Well, for some people it isn't, because their genes don't have the enzyme to metabolize, say, oxalate. And they don't even know that. And, they're getting kidney stones, they're getting inflammation, etc. But now you cannot change the genes your parents gave you. That's the deck of cards you got. Although you can change their activity, that's what we know from epigenetics. But still, the range of genes you have, 25,000 genes from your parents, that's what you got from your parents. But you have 2 million to 20 million bacterial genes in your body. And that population depends on what you eat. You can change your diet and find out what your microbiome is. Within a week, you'll have a completely different genetic information from your microbial gene expression. So nutrition acquires a whole new understanding. If your food is manufactured, refined, processed, has too much sugar, is got antibiotics, hormones, pesticides, petroleum stuff, pesticides are petroleum products, or any other chemicals, then the microbiome is, it's after all the bacteria of the earth. And they're not used to this, but they're slowly getting used to it, perhaps because 30% of the microbiome has disappeared in urban societies. A lot of correlations are being made between chronic disease, inflammation, and what they call dysbiosis. So you can correct this dysbiosis through diet. 5 things I mentioned, and the 6th is something very interesting. How many people have occasionally walked barefoot on the ground, on the earth, on the beach, or on grass? You feel better, right? Well, it's very interesting. What happens when you walk barefoot on the earth, negative ions come from the earth and neutralize the excess free radicals that build up in our bodies as a result of daily stresses, and inflammation goes down. So we have recently published some papers on this. We also, by the way, published a paper recently on gratitude, the feeling of gratitude. If you just write down at the end of the day what you were grateful for, your inflammatory markers...
That's in this book.
Your inflammatory markers come down.
The gratitude exercise.
Okay, so gratitude will bring down inflammation in your body. And grounding or earthing will bring down inflammation in your body. And other than that, our bodies respond to biological rhythms. Everyone's heard about circadian rhythms. If you have jet lag, that's a disruption in circadian rhythm. As the earth spins on its own axis, your body also has rhythms that correspond to the earth spinning on its axis. But we have seasonal rhythms, we have tidal rhythms, gravitational rhythms, lunar rhythms, because we are part of this symphony that we call the cosmos. This is a microcosm of that. So when you walk on the ground, theoretically, nobody has looked at that, and we are now beginning to look at it. You should be restoring your circadian rhythms just by connecting with the earth. Your body is a battery, so is the earth. And you're resynchronizing or resetting the battery. But if the earth and the circadian rhythms are connected to all the other rhythms, in a sense, you might be linking to them. So now we're looking at that too. And as you know, the Nobel Prize last year was in medicine and biology was for biological clocks. every cell in your body has a clock, and these clocks are, some of them are independent of the other clocks, but they're still part of nature's rhythms. So in summary, that's a little bit of the healing self. Ultimately, though, the healing self also involves spiritual healing, which means going beyond the fear of death, understanding your true nature as the Buddha said, as consciousness, and transcendence, going beyond subject-object split, which is artificial. I'm the subject, you're the object. For you, you're the subject, I'm the object. But in the wholeness of experience, the whole is all there is. The parts are activities of the whole. That's what the healing self is.
Very quantum, Deepak. Very quantum.
Really?
Because, the multi-particle wave function there, you cannot identify the individual particles, right?
That's right.
So we end on a note of agreement.
Finally! Thank you. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you both so much. Those of you who are just joining us on Facebook, we've been celebrating the ideas behind Leonard Mlodinow's elastic, flexible thinking in a time of change, and Deepak Chopra's The Healing Self. And suitably and fittingly, they have found confluence in their ideas around the idea of gratitude. Flexible adaptation allows for greater healing. So with that in mind, we invite you to ask questions. We've got microphones on either side of the house, and in the interest of minimizing any stress to the rest of the audience, do keep your questions as succinct and as to the point as possible. That will make us all grateful. So who would like to venture first and be neophilic about this all? Yes, sir. In the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5th row. Yes, thank you so much. And there's a hand at the back, I believe. Thank you, Daphne. Yes.
Thank you both very much. Wondering, Leonard, if you could give us some practical tips for how we can think more elastically.
That was there, by the way, in my list of questions. Thank you.
Would you like to paraphrase the question just so everybody else could hear? I mean, the way you...
I can not only paraphrase, but I can say, I guess I got the beginning a little wrong. Hey, Leonard, can you tell us how we can think more elastically? So there's a lot of things that you can do. I think that since we were just talking about this, one of the most basic things is to increase your level of mindfulness so that you know how you're thinking and you know what your approach is in the first place so that you can question it. And you can use that same method kind of along the lines of what Deepak was talking about with the cognitive behavioral therapy to also learn to identify and question the assumptions that you're making. We were just talking about gratitude. So positive emotion tends to increase elastic thinking. A negative emotion tends to focus you. If there's a tiger in the room and you get scared, you're focused on getting away. Or if you're angry at someone, you're focused on doing something about it. But if you're happy, you're not focused on anything in particular, on any action. And a lot of it, elastic thinking, has to do with just that, with relieving, broadening your thinking and relieving the focus of your brain. Learning to let go, to let go of a problem, to just kick back. And lay on a couch and let things percolate. If you have employees and you walk past one, or if you're an employee and you're laying on the couch, you tend to think someone laying on the couch is not working. But I'm telling you, that can be the best part of work, and where the ideas come from. Everyone is either a morning. I'm just giving you a core dump of some of the ideas, but you might be not everyone, but a lot of people are either morning people or evening people. Well, scientists have found out that when your brain is exhausted, when your rational, logical thinking brain is exhausted, that impedes the executive filters that are keeping ideas from coming to you. So thinking quietly about a problem at the time when you feel mentally exhausted can help you find the solutions to the problem. The space that you work in affects the way you think. If you're in a very bright space, a noisy space, that tends to that tends to focus you on what's happening. The noise, the brightness tends to take your mind away from its quiet thoughts. Low ceilings are bad. High work in a space like this that's open, or just go to a park and sit. So there's a lot of subtle things that you can do to take control of the way you're thinking and to change your mindset and to help you think more elastically.
Thank you. We had a hand up at the back, I believe, Daphne, yes?
I have a question for each of you.
Yeah.
The first one is, if you look at the baseline fMRI and predict whether it's going to be elastic or logical thinking, is that predilection constant, or is it elastic one time?
From problem to problem. Generally, in these experiments, they generally did. They had one approach, but there's a great story, which Deepak will appreciate. They did an experiment on a very experienced meditator. And they gave him those CRA, the compound word problem that I mentioned with the 3 words, and you find the 4th word that fits. And he did horribly. This isn't the good part yet. he did horribly. He couldn't get any of them right. And I talked to the scientist who did the experiment. He said he was a little bit embarrassed for the guy, and he came in and thanked him and said, we've had enough, and I appreciate your volunteering. And the guy said, no, let me get back to it. Let's try it again. And after that little break, he got them all right. So beforehand, he was one of the least successful, and afterwards, he was about the most successful that this scientist had seen. And he said in all his years of doing this, he'd never seen someone switch from one way to the other. And he talked to the person afterwards, and this person had the ability to have this tremendous focus. And he started doing these problems using the logical rational approach. And it wasn't working for him. And these are designed, by the way, to mislead you if you use that approach to be unsuccessful. I won't get into how, but they choose the words in a certain way to give you, just like in the riddle, the wrong idea, the wrong assumption, the wrong picture in your mind, and then lead you away from the right answer. And he couldn't get the right answer. But at the interruption, he told the researcher that he realized that he needs to do the opposite and open his mind and let the ideas just come to him. And after that, they went like that. So he was able to recognize and control the way he approached the problem. And I think that was a very important example.
So I have employed the following process myself, and I'll share it with you. It's not in the book. I use 9 steps, and just for the sake of convenience, they all begin with I, the letter I. So the first step is, any problem I have, I gather information. These days you can gather information on the internet, on anything, right? So first step, information gathering. The second is information analysis. So I not only gather the information, but I analyze it almost to the point of exhaustion. The third step is incubation, which is what he was doing, your friend. Okay, so incubation could be just letting go. It could be sleep. It could be meditation. It could be a walk in the park, whatever. Third step. Fourth step is, in that incubation, by the way, also there's detachment from outcome, and there is surrender to uncertainty. Because if you're certain about everything, then you're not elastic thinking anyway, right? Certainty is kind of an interference with elasticity. So surrender to uncertainty, allow the proliferation of uncertainty in that incubation period. And then there's this breakthrough that happens, which is insight. And it's an aha moment, oh. And you recognize it because you feel very good about it. And so I call that inspiration, not motivation, inspiration, which is to be in spirit. Inspiration is a spiritual experience. Motivation is a mental experience. So whatever I said, information gathering, information analysis, incubation, insight, inspiration. implementation. You try it out. Does it work or not? Then integration, you integrate it with everything else you know, 8th step. And final, incarnation. It's a death and a resurrection. So again, this is very Buddhist, guys. Creativity in elasticity is both a death and a resurrection, which means death of all the old contexts, all the old stories, all the meanings, all the relationships and how you interpreted them. They're gone, and something new has emerged. So that's elastic.
It's very elastic.
I have my second question.
Yes. Oh, well, no, sorry. I think one question per person is the fairest thing we can do. So perhaps if we could get a microphone to the lady in the third row. And who else would like to ask a question while we have an opportunity? This gentleman, Alison, the second to last row, a little further back. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
What about somebody that has depression and the elastic mind? I mean, if you have depression, normally your mind is always in the same way of thinking. Do you have any experience on that?
Well, depression can mean many things, but if you're clinically depressed to the extent that you have trouble functioning, you're probably not going to have a lot of elastic thinking because you're not really going to be actively approaching a problem and thinking about it. If you have a lesser level, then it really isn't directly related. It's just a question of your motivation and your energy at attacking something.
Deepak, do you have, as a medical doctor, some suggestions for breaking out of either a traumatic state?
You know, there's so many reasons a person can be depressed, but recently I've been looking at the literature, and depression precedes almost every chronic illness. There's an element of depression that precedes that. And then if you look deeper into that, anxiety is underlying the depression. So anxiety is first, and then depression is second. Now, I mentioned earlier the microbiome, that 90% of your serotonin is being produced in the gut, which we didn't know. So exercise, yoga, breathing, changing your diet could eliminate many kinds of depression. But then there are serious types of psychosis that I'm not addressing right now.
Thank you for that advice. Yes, sir, I believe you've got the microphone.
Yeah. I was recently reading an article in the Discovery magazine about Stuart Hameroff, who talked about microtubules and quantum mechanics. So it seems like a lot of physicists have a very inelastic thinking that quantum mechanics doesn't play any role in the brain. In light of recent discoveries, what is your opinion? This is for Leonard. Do you personally believe that now, with the latest discoveries, that quantum mechanics might play? What is your personal belief?
Well, Stuart is a very good friend of mine. Yes. And he's probably going to see this. And next week we have a conference coming up, Science of Consciousness, and he might even confront me about this. Stuart's background is anesthesiology. And when you give anesthesia, by the way, nobody really knows how anesthesia works, but it works. And there are so many types of anesthesia. But a lot of anesthetics act on microtubules in the brain. So that's where his theories come from. I do not personally think that microtubules are quantum mechanical, although the microtubules are small enough that you could think of them as very micro structures. I do feel, though, and this is something I have to be careful before a physicist who talks about quantum mechanics all the time. But if you look at waves and particles as having this matter having this dual nature, then particles are in the realm of materiality. They have units of mass and energy. But waves of probability are the potential for that. So I do see a connection between creativity and elastic thinking and the ability to settle into a state of being which is totally detached from outcome and allows the proliferation of probability waves or ideas in consciousness till they suddenly collapse into an insight. But I'm using this metaphorically, okay?
Okay.
Because
I'm glad you said that.
I'm saying this metaphorically.
I love it. It's metaphors are, yes.
Okay, but on the other hand, I also think, and again I'll say this with trepidation, that all science is a metaphor.
I would also agree with that. So again, we agree.
All right, so we've given the conversation about the broader aspects of time, we have reached the time at which we can invite only one last question. But fear not, we do have a reception upstairs, and Leonard and Deepak have kindly agreed to sign copies of the books that you have in your bag or on your lap. But hopefully you'll remove them from your lap in order for them to sign them. And that will be upstairs, and of course you're also invited to a glass of wine upstairs as well. So let's do, for this final question, an experiment in the spirit of what has happened this evening. And let's practice a little neophilia and elasticity. So the last question should really come from someone who's never posed a question in public before. And so whoever would like to summon that courage and try out something new, this is your chance. Yes, well done. A round of applause. Roki. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'm thinking about the microbiome and how that can be affected from someone who lives in an urban area or rural area. So if we are exposed to food that is highly chemical and refined or anything like that, and we start killing some of those bacteria,
say that again?
We start killing or affecting our microbiome to a way that it changes. Can that be restored at some point?
Yes, you can change your microbiome within a few days by changing your diet. Now, without going into the artificial intelligence ways of looking at it, and this is happening now, and this is a great development, maximum diversity of plant-based foods is the best thing for you. Maximum diversity of plant-based foods is the best thing. You will change your microbiome.
A great question, by the way.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, in order to give you gentlemen the last word, and we've been talking about healing and elasticity, is there any advice other than what you've offered already that will perhaps give us the resilience to deal with what's outside the doors of the Rubin?
Well, one issue that we didn't talk about much that is important and is related to that question is the idea of failure and of having the fear of asking a bad question or having a stupid idea. This is one of the biggest poisons to elastic thinking. You must be free to have dumb not just wrong, but dumb ideas in order to have good ideas, because you need those ideas to come from your unconscious and to come into your mind. And I think that the relation of that liberating yourself from the fear of failure is relevant to what you said, because the outside world is in a bit of turmoil with some distressing events happening almost hourly these days. And I think that we should also liberate ourselves from the fear of the whole thing collapsing, and have the hope that the organism of our country and our world will right itself again.
And you know, ultimately, whatever is happening there is a manifestation of our collective consciousness, right? So even though we tend to blame the politicians, the president, or whoever, they represent our collective psyche. And I've said to Leonard many times that as I look at the world these days, it looks totally insane to me. And if you don't agree with that, then you're declaring your own insanity. I mean, it is insane. What we're doing is risking our extinction with modern capacities and tribal, medieval mindsets. And so the best thing we can do to change that out there is, in Mahatma Gandhi's word, be the change we want to see.
Those are fitting words for the future. So go outside, embrace a little